The morning sun of Station Helios 9 poured through the massive windows of the Galactic Defense Academy, and the light touched everything with a golden warmth that made the building look almost peaceful. But inside the Advanced Tactics classroom, peace was the last thing on anyone's mind. Instructor Vethrol stood at the front of the room, his massive Kethmari body casting a shadow that stretched all the way to the third row of seats. And his forearms were folded across his chest as he watched the cadets file in one by one, each of them young and proud, and certain that they were the future of galactic peacekeeping. The room filled quickly with the best and brightest from a dozen different worlds, and among them were the tall and elegant Veldorians with their silver skin, the sharp-minded Deshans with their 3 eyes that missed nothing, and scattered throughout the seats were humans from Earth and her colonies, all of them wearing crisp new uniforms and badges that gleamed under the lights. "Welcome to Advanced Combat Tactics," Vethrol announced in his deep rumbling voice, and his words echoed off the walls like thunder rolling across mountains. "You are here because you showed promise in your first 2 years. But promise means nothing if you cannot survive what comes next." The cadets sat straighter in their seats, and their eyes shone with determination and hunger for glory. And Drextel, a young Veldorian with silver skin that sparkled like starlight, leaned over to his companion and whispered something that made them both laugh quietly. The door at the back of the room opened with a soft hiss, and every head turned to see who dared to arrive late on the first day of the semester. An old human woman stepped through the doorway, and for a moment nobody moved or spoke or even breathed. She was small, barely reaching the shoulder of most cadets, and her hair was gray like morning clouds before a storm, and she walked with a slight limp that made her progress slow and careful. And pinned to her chest was a badge so old and rusted that nobody could read what it said. Her uniform was strange and outdated, the style from 40 years ago, at least. And the fabric was worn thin in places and patched in others. And she carried herself with a quietness that seemed out of place in a room full of young warriors eager for battle. Drextel was the first to break the silence, and his voice rang out clear and mocking across the classroom. As the academy started accepting grandmothers now, he asked with a laugh that spread through the room like ripples on water. Perhaps she got lost on her way to the retirement center. Laughter erupted from a dozen throats, and even some of the human cadets looked away in embarrassment, ashamed to be associated with this relic from another era who had somehow wandered into their midst. The old woman said nothing at all, and her face remained calm as a frozen lake. And she simply walked to an empty seat in the back row and sat down without a word, pulling out an old datapad that looked almost as ancient as her uniform. Instructor Vethrol watched her settle into her seat, and his 4 eyes studied her for a long moment, but he saw nothing remarkable. Just an old woman who was probably some retired officer wanting to relive memories of better days. "As I was saying," Vethrol continued, turning his attention back to the class, "this semester will test everything you think you know about combat and strategy and survival. And those who fail will be sent back to the basic courses where perhaps they belong." The cadets nodded eagerly, all except for the old woman in the back, who simply sat and watched and waited. When Vethrol began the roll call, reading names from his datapad in that booming voice of his, the classroom responded with enthusiasm and pride. "Drextel of House Voldor, present and ready for glory, Instructor. Yelthira of the Deshan Diplomatic Corps, present, Instructor." The names continued one after another, species after species, until finally Vethrol reached a name near the end of the list. "Yun Su Min of Earth, present," came the quiet reply from the back of the room, and her voice was soft but steady like a river that has flowed for 1,000 years. Yelthira, the old Deshan cadet with diplomatic training, frowned at the name, and her 3 eyes narrowed as if she was trying to remember something important. something that danced just at the edge of her memory like a song half forgotten. But the moment passed and the class continued, and nobody else seemed to notice or care about the strange reaction. The first lecture began, and Vethril spoke of battle formations and tactical retreats, and the importance of knowing when to fight and when to flee. And his words were full of wisdom earned through decades of combat across 100 worlds. The young cadets took notes furiously, their styluses dancing across datapads as they tried to capture every word of wisdom. But in the back row, Su-Min simply listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes seeing something far beyond the classroom walls. When the lecture ended and cadets began to file out for their next class, Drextel made sure to walk past the old woman's seat, and he looked down at her with contempt bright in his silver eyes. "That badge of yours looks ready to fall apart," he said with a sneer that twisted his handsome features into something ugly. "Whatever war you fought in must have been a very long time ago, grandmother." Su-Min looked up at him, and for just a moment something flickered in her dark eyes. Something old and deep and vast like the space between stars. But then it was gone, and she simply nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "It was a very long time ago." Drexdale laughed again and walked away with his friends, their mocking voices echoing down the hallway. And Su-Min remained in her seat for a long moment, her fingers touching the rusted badge on her chest with a gentleness that spoke of memories too heavy to carry. The classroom emptied around her, and still she sat. And when she finally rose to leave, her limp seemed just a little more pronounced, as if the weight of years was pressing down upon her shoulders. But her back was straight, and her head was high, and whatever storms raged behind those quiet eyes remained hidden from the world. In the hallway outside, a young human cadet named Park Ki-hoon watched her pass, and something about the way she moved made him stop and stare, and he wondered who she really was and why her name had made the old Daishin react so strangely. That night, alone in his quarters, Ji-hoon searched the academy database for information about Yoon Su-min, and what he found made his blood run cold. The file was classified at the highest level, a level he had never seen before, and when he tried to access even the basic information, warning messages flashed across his screen in red letters that seemed to burn with secrets too dangerous to speak. Who was this old woman with the rusted badge and the gentle voice, and what had she done to earn such secrecy? The answers would come, but not tonight, and not easily. And Ji-hoon closed his datapad with shaking hands and lay awake until morning, wondering what legend had walked into their classroom wearing the face of someone's grandmother. 2 weeks had passed since the incident in the training hall, and the whispers about the old woman had not stopped, but they had changed from mockery to curiosity to something that felt almost like respect. Drextel had not challenged her again, and whenever he saw her in the hallways, he looked away quickly, and the shame of his defeat still burned in his silver eyes. But nobody yet understood who she really was, and the secret of her identity remained buried beneath decades of classified files and forgotten memories. That changed on a cold morning in the middle of the 3rd week, during a lecture that none of the cadets would ever forget. Instructor Vethril stood at the front of the classroom with a holographic display behind him, and his voice was solemn as he introduced the day's topic. "Today, we will study one of the most important battles in galactic history," he announced, and his forearms manipulated the display to show images of a burning planet. The Siege of Vanthos Prime. A murmur rippled through the classroom, and even the most distracted cadets sat up straighter in their seats, because everyone knew of Vanthos Prime. And everyone knew that what happened there had shaped the entire galaxy. 43 years ago, Vethril continued, the Krethver Dominion launched a surprise attack on the human colony of Vanthos Prime, and 10,000 raiders descended upon a world that had only a small defense force to protect it. The holographic display showed the battle unfolding, Ships falling from the sky, cities burning, civilians running through streets filled with smoke and fire. The colony's population was nearly 200,000, Methrol said, and most of them were families, workers, children who had no means to defend themselves. He paused and let the weight of his words settle over the classroom. An evacuation was ordered, but the transport ships needed time to prepare, and someone had to hold the evacuation point against the Krethver while the civilians boarded the ships. The display changed to show a narrow passage between two mountains, a natural choke point. That led to the landing pads where the transports waited. 200 human soldiers volunteered to hold that passage. Vethril said quietly, 200 against 10,000. The classroom was utterly silent, and in the back row, Su-Min's hands had begun to tremble, and her face had grown pale as morning snow. For 6 hours they fought, Vethril continued, and one by one they fell, but they did not retreat, and they did not surrender. And by the time the battle ended, only 11 of them were still alive. His voice grew soft with something that sounded almost like reverence. But they succeeded, and every single civilian, all 197,000 of them, made it safely onto the transport ships and escaped the planet. A Theshan cadet raised her hand and asked the question that everyone was thinking. Who commanded them? Instructor? Vethril shook his massive head slowly. That is the strangest part of this story, he admitted. The commander's identity was never officially confirmed, and the records from that battle were lost or destroyed. But the survivors spoke of a small human woman who seemed to be everywhere at once. The display changed again to show blurry images captured during the battle. And in one of them, barely visible through smoke and fire, was a small figure carrying what looked like children on her back while firing a weapon with one hand. They called her the Ghost of Vanthos, Vethril said, because she moved like a ghost through the battlefield, appearing wherever the fighting was worst, saving lives that should have been lost. His voice dropped even lower. The survivors said that at the final breach, when the Krethver had broken through and the last transport was still loading, she stood alone against the enemy for 11 minutes. Gasps rippled through the classroom, because 11 minutes alone against an army was not possible, not even for the greatest warriors. She was wounded 17 times, Vethril continued, and still she fought, and still she stood, until the transport lifted off and the remaining soldiers could finally retreat. He turned away from the display and faced the class. Many believe she died that day, and others believe she never existed at all, that she was just a legend created to inspire hope. In the back row, Su-Min had set down her stylus, and her hand was pressed flat against the desk as if she needed to steady herself. And then, from across the room, a voice rang out with shock and recognition. Ambassador Yelthira, the old Theshan cadet who had frowned at Su-Min's name on the first day, was on her feet, and all 3 of her eyes were wide with disbelief. I know who you are, she said, and her voice trembled like leaves in a storm. My grandmother was on Vanthos Prime, and she was one of the children you carried. Every head in the classroom turned toward Su-Min. She told me stories about you when I was young, Yelthira continued, her voice growing stronger. She told me about the small human woman who ran through fire to save her, who carried her and 2 other children on her back while bullets flew all around. Tears were streaming down Yelthira's face now. She told me that woman had a badge on her chest, a badge from Earth, and that she never forgot the face of the person who saved her life. The classroom had become so silent that you could hear hearts beating. You are the Ghost of Vanthos, Yelthira said, with absolute certainty. You are Commander. Yun! Su-Min did not deny it. She did not speak at all for a long moment. And when she finally looked up, her dark eyes were filled with memories that stretched back through decades of pain and loss. That was a very long time ago, she said softly. I am just here to learn. But her words could not undo what had been revealed, and the cadets stared at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. This small, limping, gray-haired woman with the rusted badge was not just some retired officer. She was a legend, a myth made flesh, a warrior whose name was spoken in whispers across 100 worlds. Instructor Vethrol had not moved since Yelthira's revelation, and his massive form seemed frozen in place, and in his 4 eyes was a look of shock that slowly transformed into something deeper. He had taught a legend as if she were a novice. He had watched her be mocked and laughed at and humiliated, and he had done nothing. The shame of that realization burned in his chest like a fire that would not go out. Sumin gathered her datapad and rose from her seat, and the class parted before her like water before a ship, and not a single voice made a sound as she walked toward the door. At the doorway she paused and looked back at them, at all those young faces staring at her with wonder and disbelief. The people who died on Vanthos were the real heroes. She said quietly, "I was just the one who survived." And then she was gone, and the classroom erupted into chaos, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first week of the semester passed like water through fingers, and the old woman named Yoon Soo-min became something of a joke among the cadets, a source of amusement that they returned to again and again whenever the training grew too hard or the lectures too boring. She participated when called upon, and her answers were always simple and short. But there was something strange about the way she spoke, something precise and careful that made a few of the smarter cadets wonder if perhaps they were missing something important. But most dismissed her as a curiosity, an old relic from a forgotten war who had somehow found her way into their prestigious academy. And they laughed at her behind her back, and sometimes to her face. And she never responded with anger or hurt. Drexdale was the worst of them all, and his mockery grew bolder with each passing day. And by the end of the first week, he had decided that it was time to prove once and for all that this old woman did not belong among true warriors. The physical training hall was massive and gleaming, filled with combat platforms and training drones and weapons of every kind. And Instructor Vethrol watched from an elevated platform as cadets paired off for sparring practice. "Today we will test your hand-to-hand combat skills," Vethrol announced, his forearms gesturing toward the fighting platforms. "Choose your partners and show me what you can do." Drexdale's silver eyes found Soo-min across the hall, and a cruel smile spread across his face as he walked toward her with his friends following close behind. "I choose the grandmother," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "unless she is too old and fragile to accept the challenge." The hall fell silent, and dozens of eyes turned to watch, and Soo-min looked up at the tall Veldorian with an expression that revealed nothing at all. "If you wish," she said softly, and she set down her datapad and walked to the nearest combat platform with that same slow and careful limp. Drexdale jumped onto the platform with the grace of a born warrior, his silver skin gleaming under the lights. And he raised his fists in the traditional Veldorian fighting stance that had won him championships on his homeworld. "Try not to break a hip, grandmother," he called out, and laughter rippled through the watching crowd. Soo-min climbed onto the platform slowly, and she stood there with her arms hanging loose at her sides, and she did not raise her fist or take any fighting stance at all. Instructor Vethrol leaned forward in his seat, and something about the way the old woman stood made him pay closer attention. "Begin," the training computer announced. Drexdale lunged forward with blinding speed, his fist cutting through the air towards Soo-min's face, and the watching cadets held their breath as they waited to see the old woman crumble. But Soo-min was not there anymore. She moved like smoke in a windstorm, flowing around his attack with a grace that seemed impossible for someone her age. And before Drexdale understood what was happening, she was behind him. He spun and attacked again, faster this time, a combination of strikes that would have overwhelmed most opponents, but each blow found only empty air. And then, in 3 movements so quick that nobody saw them clearly, Drextel was on the ground. His face was pressed against the platform, and his weapon arm was locked in a grip that he could not break, no matter how hard he struggled. And the old woman stood over him with one knee on his back and her hand controlling his wrist with perfect precision. The hall was silent as a tomb, and not a single cadet moved or spoke or even breathed. Su-min held the lock for exactly 3 seconds, and then she released him gently and stepped back, and she offered her hand to help him up. Drextel stared at her hand as if it were a poisonous snake, and his face burned with shame that was worse than any physical pain. And he pushed himself up without her help and stumbled off the platform without looking back. The crowd parted to let him pass, and nobody laughed now, and nobody made jokes about grandmothers or retirement centers. Instructor Vethral watched Su-min climb down from the platform and return to her seat, and his 4 eyes were filled with new interest and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. That night, the mess hall was quieter than usual, and cadets ate their meals with thoughtful expressions as they replayed what they had seen in the training hall. Park Ji-hoon found Su-min sitting alone at a corner table, a cup of tea steaming in her hands, and after a long moment of hesitation, he walked over and stood before her. "May I sit with you?" he asked, and his voice was respectful in a way that none of the other cadets had managed. Su-min looked up at him and smiled, and it was a kind smile that made her weathered face seem almost young. "Of course," she said. "Please." Ji-hoon sat down across from her, and for a while, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. "How did you do that today?" Ji-hoon finally asked. "Drextel is one of the best fighters in the academy, and you made him look like a child." Su-min wrapped her hands around her teacup and looked into the steam rising from the surface, and her eyes grew distant. "When you have fought in enough battles," she said quietly, "you learn that speed and strength are not everything. And sometimes, the warriors who survive are not the fastest or the strongest, but the ones who understand timing and patience." "What battles?" Ji-hoon pressed gently. "What war did you fight in?" Su-min was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of years and memories. "Old battles," she said. "Ones that most people have forgotten, and ones that I wish I could forget." She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through to his soul, and she smiled again. "You are different from the others," she observed. "You are curious, but not cruel, and that is a rare thing in young warriors." Ji-hoon felt his face grow warm at the compliment, and he looked down at the table. "I tried to find information about you in the Academy database," he admitted, "but everything is classified at the highest level." Su-min nodded slowly, and something flickered in her eyes that might have been sadness or might have been relief. "Some stories are not meant to be told," she said, "and some names are better left buried." She reached across the table and patted his hand with a gentleness that reminded him of his own grandmother back on Earth. "But I will tell you this, young Park Ji-hoon," she continued. "The most important battles are not the ones we fight with weapons, but the ones we fight with our hearts. And the true measure of a warrior is not how many enemies they defeat, but how many people they save." Ji-hoon wanted to ask more questions, wanted to understand who this mysterious woman really was, but something in her expression told him that the conversation was over for tonight. He stood and bowed respectfully, and Su-min smiled and raised her teacup in a small salute. As he walked away, Ji-hoon glanced back and saw her sitting there alone, her fingers touching the rusted badge on her chest, and her lips moved silently as if she was speaking to ghosts that only she could see. The mystery of Yoon Su-min would have to wait for another day, but Ji-hoon knew in his heart that the truth, when it finally came to light, would change everything he thought he knew about heroes and legends and the price of glory. That night, In dormitories across the academy, cadets whispered about what they had witnessed. And for the first time since she arrived, they spoke of the old woman not with mockery, but with something that felt almost like fear. And in her small quarters, Su-min sat by the window and looked out at the stars. And if tears rolled down her weathered cheeks, there was no one there to see them fall. The final week of the semester arrived with a tension that hung over the academy like a gathering storm, and every cadet knew that the examination would test everything they had learned. Instructor Vethral had changed since his conversation with Su-min, and his lectures now spoke not only of tactics and strategy, but of honor and sacrifice and the true meaning of wearing the uniform. The cadets had changed too, and there was a new seriousness in their eyes, a new understanding that being a warrior meant more than just knowing how to fight. The final examination was to be a large-scale simulation, a recreation of a civilian evacuation under enemy fire, and the entire class would participate together in a massive simulation chamber. Remember, Vethral announced as the cadets gathered at the entrance, your mission is not to defeat the enemy, but to protect the civilians. And every life you save matters more than every enemy you destroy. The cadets nodded with understanding, and among them stood Su-min, her rusted badge gleaming dully in the artificial light. The simulation began, and the chamber transformed into a burning city, with holographic civilians running through the streets and training drones playing the role of enemy soldiers. The cadets worked together with precision and purpose, forming protective formations around the civilians and guiding them toward the extraction point. Ji-hoon led one team through a side street, his voice calm and steady as he directed the flow of evacuees. Drexdale commanded another group, and his silver skin flashed as he moved to intercept an enemy patrol, giving the civilians time to pass. Everything was going according to plan, until suddenly it was not. A sharp alarm blared through the chamber, and red lights began flashing on the walls. And Instructor Vethral's voice came through the speakers with an edge of panic. All cadets, system malfunction. This is not part of the exercise. One section of the chamber had sealed itself, trapping 7 cadets inside with training drones that had somehow switched to lethal settings, and the safety protocols that should have prevented this had failed completely. Through the observation windows, the trapped cadets could be seen backing against the walls as 6 combat drones advanced toward them with weapons charging. "We cannot open the doors," a technician shouted. "The system is locked down." Drexdale was among the trapped cadets, and his face was pale with fear as he tried to shield the others with his body. The watching cadets pounded on the glass and screamed for help, but there was nothing they could do. And then, without a word, Su-min moved. She walked to an emergency access panel and ripped it open with strength that seemed impossible for her small frame, and her fingers flew across the controls with the speed of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. A small maintenance hatch slid open, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and without hesitation, Su-min dropped to her knees and crawled inside. "No!" Vethral roared. "Commander, you cannot!" But she was already gone, disappearing into the narrow passage with the determination of someone who had faced death before and emerged victorious. Inside the sealed chamber, the drones were closing in on the trapped cadets, and Drexdale had picked up a piece of debris to use as a weapon, knowing it would not be enough. The first drone raised its weapon, and Drexdale closed his eyes. And then the maintenance hatch on the far wall exploded outward, and Su-min rolled through the opening like a ghost made flesh. She came up with a broken pipe in her hand, and before the drone could fire, she was upon it, striking with a precision that spoke of decades of combat experience. The drone collapsed in a shower of sparks. The other 5 drones turned to face this new threat, and Su-min was moving again, flowing through the space like water, striking and dodging and dancing with death as if they were old partners who knew each other's steps. 2 more drones fell, their circuits shattered by impossible strikes. A 4th drone fired, and Sumin twisted to avoid the shot, but she was not fast enough, and the beam caught her shoulder and spun her around. She did not stop. The 5th drone lunged at Drextel, and Sumin threw herself between them, taking the blow meant for him. And the impact sent her crashing to the ground. But even as she fell, her hand shot out and grabbed the drone's leg, pulling it off balance, and Drextel brought his piece of debris down on its head with all his strength. The 6th and final drone advanced, and Sumin rose to her feet with blood streaming from her wounds, and in her eyes was the same fire that had burned at Vanthos Prime 43 years ago. She charged. The drone fired again and again, and some of the shots found their mark. But she did not stop. She could not stop, not while there were still people to protect. With a final desperate lunge, she drove the broken pipe through the drone's central processor, and the machine shuddered and collapsed. The chamber fell silent, and Sumin stood swaying among the wreckage, her body pierced in 4 places, her old uniform soaked with blood. Then she fell, and Drextel caught her before she hit the ground. "Hold on," he begged. "Please hold on." Sumin smiled up at him with blood on her lips. "See," she whispered, "I told you that you were not cruel." The doors finally burst open, and emergency teams rushed in, and Sumin was carried away on a stretcher while the entire academy watched in stunned silence. 3 days later, the medical bay was quiet, and Sumin lay in a bed with bandages covering her wounds, but her eyes were open and clear. Instructor Vethrol entered the room, and behind him came the entire class, filling the hallway outside the door with faces full of emotion. Vethrol walked to her bedside, and slowly, with a grace that seemed impossible for his massive form, he knelt. He lowered his head until his forehead nearly touched the floor, and when he spoke, his voice trembled with respect. "Forgive me, Commander," he said. "I taught tactics for 30 years and forgot what it meant to be a true warrior." Sumin reached out and touched his shoulder with her unwounded hand. "You did not forget," she said softly. "You just needed to be reminded, and we all do sometimes." Ji-hoon stepped forward, and in his hands was her rusted earth badge, carefully polished until the words were finally visible. "Earth Defense Force, Commander Class." He handed it to her, and she took it with trembling fingers and pinned it back on her hospital gown. "What happens now?" Drextel asked from the doorway. "What will you do?" Sumin looked at all the young faces gathered around her, faces that had once laughed at her, and now looked at her with something approaching reverence. "I think I will stay a little longer," she said with a smile. "Someone needs to make sure you youngsters learn the right lessons." The cadets laughed, and the sound was warm and full of hope. 1 week later, the Academy's entrance hall was unveiled after renovations, and above the main doors hung a new motto, suggested by Instructor Vethrol and approved unanimously by the Academy Council. The words gleamed in golden letters: "Fight not for glory, but for those who cannot." And beneath them, in smaller script, was an addition that Yelthira had proposed. "In memory of the 200 who gave everything at Vanthos Prime." Sumin stood in the crowd of cadets who had gathered for the unveiling, and Ji-hoon noticed that for the first time since she had arrived, she was crying. But these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of peace, the tears of someone who had finally found her way home after wandering in darkness for 43 years. The rusted badge on her chest caught the light, and for just a moment, it seemed to shine as brightly as it had on the day she first earned it, when she was young and the galaxy was full of hope. The legend of the Ghost of Vanthos would live on, but now it had a face and a name, and the cadets, who had laughed at an old woman, would carry her lessons with them for the rest of their lives. And somewhere, among the stars, the spirits of 200 fallen soldiers smiled. because their sacrifice had not been forgotten, and the woman who had led them had finally found peace. The news spread through the academy like fire through dry grass, and by nightfall there was not a single being on Station Helios 9 who had not heard the name Yoon Soo-min. Cadets gathered in common rooms and dormitories, their datapads glowing as they searched for every scrap of information about the siege of Vantos Prime. And what they found made them grow quiet and thoughtful. The casualty reports were horrifying, and the odds had been so impossible that military historians still argued about how the human defenders had managed to hold for even an hour, let alone 6. Images of the battlefield showed a landscape of fire and death. And in the survivors' testimonies were stories of a small woman who seemed to be everywhere at once, pulling wounded soldiers to safety, carrying children through smoke and flame, fighting with a fury that made even the Krethver hesitate. She was wounded 17 times, one cadet read aloud to his companions, and she kept fighting. And when we tried to make her stop, she said that she would rest when everyone was safe. Another cadet found an interview with a survivor who had served under Commander Yoon. I saw her take a blade meant for a child, the survivor had said. She did not even cry out, just kept moving, kept fighting, kept saving lives. In his private quarters, Drextel sat alone with his head in his hands, and the memory of his cruelty burned in his mind like acid. He had mocked her. He had called her grandmother and laughed at her rusted badge and challenged her to a fight as if she were some worthless old fool. And all along she had been the ghost of Vantos, a warrior whose courage and sacrifice had saved nearly 200,000 lives. The shame was unbearable, and Drextel knew that he could not carry it any longer. He found Soo-min in the academy gardens, sitting on a stone bench beneath a tree that had been brought from Earth, its leaves rustling in the recycled air of the station. She looked up as he approached, and there was no anger in her eyes, no judgment, just a quiet patience that made his shame burn even hotter. Drextel stopped before her and dropped to his knees in the Veldorian way of deepest apology, his forehead touching the ground, his arms spread wide in surrender. "Forgive me," he said, and his voice cracked with emotion. "I was cruel and stupid and blind, and I shame myself with my treatment of you." Soo-min rose from the bench and walked to where he knelt, and she placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "Stand up," she said softly. "Look at me." Drextel rose slowly, and when he met her eyes he saw no anger, only kindness. "Pride is not weakness," she told him. "Cruelty is, but you were not cruel. Young one, you were just young." Tears were streaming down Drextel's silver cheeks, and he could not remember the last time he had wept. "How can you forgive me so easily?" he asked. Soo-min smiled, and it was a smile that held both sadness and warmth. "Because I remember being young," she said, "and I remember making mistakes, and I remember learning that the measure of a warrior is not whether they fall, but whether they choose to rise." She patted his shoulder once more and turned to walk away. "Go and rest," she called back to him. "Tomorrow we have training, and I expect you to work harder than you ever have before." Drextel watched her go, and something had changed inside him, something deep and permanent that he would carry for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Instructor Vethrol had been struggling with his own storm of emotions, and after 3 days of internal debate, he finally requested a private meeting with Soo-min. They met in his office, a large space decorated with weapons and trophies from his decades of service, and he stood at attention as she entered, a gesture of respect that he rarely offered to anyone. "Please sit, Commander," he said, gesturing to a chair. Soo-min shook her head gently. "I am not a commander anymore," she said. "I am just a student." Vethrol studied her for a long moment, his 4 eyes searching her face for answers to questions he was not sure how to ask. "Why are you here?" he finally said. Why would a living legend sit in the classroom with cadets young enough to be her grandchildren? Soo-min walked to the window and looked out at the stars, and her reflection in the glass seemed tired and old. After the war, she began slowly. I could not stay, and I could not bear to be a symbol when so many had died, so I disappeared. She turned to face him. For 40 years, I served in places nobody cared about. Small colonies on the edge of space, settlements that the galaxy had forgotten. And I taught, and I protected, and I tried to do some good. Her voice grew softer. But I heard stories about this academy, about how it was changing, about how cadets were learning to fight but forgetting why to fight, and I wanted to see for myself if it was true. Vethral felt the weight of her words pressing down upon him, and he understood now what he had not understood before. You are not auditing a class, he said slowly. You are evaluating us. Su Min nodded. I wanted to see if this academy still taught its students to protect the weak and stand for what is right, she admitted. Or if it had become just another factory for producing soldiers who fight for glory and power. Her eyes met his, and in them was a challenge. What I have seen has been mixed, Instructor Vethral, and I have seen arrogance and cruelty, but I have also seen young people who genuinely want to help others, who understand that true strength is not about defeating enemies, but about saving lives. Vethral lowered his head, and his forearms hung loose at his sides. I have failed, he said quietly. I have taught tactics and strategy in combat, but I have forgotten to teach honor and sacrifice and compassion. Su Min walked to him and placed her small hand on one of his massive arms. You have not failed, she said. You have simply lost your way, as we all do sometimes, but the path is still there waiting for you to find it again. She smiled up at him. The cadets respect you, she continued, and they will follow where you lead, so lead them somewhere worth going. Vethral looked down at this small human woman who had done more in one battle than he had done in his entire career, and he felt something shift inside his chest. What would you have me do? He asked. Su Min's smile grew wider. Teach them that the badge they wear is not just decoration, she said, touching the rusted metal on her own chest. Teach them that every symbol carries the weight of those who wore it before, and every victory is hollow if it comes at the cost of who they are. She stepped back and straightened her old uniform. Now, if you will excuse me, I have studying to do, because unlike some people, I do not skip my homework. And with that small joke, she left his office, and Vethral stood alone with his thoughts, knowing that the next day would be the first day of a new beginning.